Mr. Courtney, you've been an experienced
Thank you.
advisor to many presidents on the issues related to Russia. Have you ever seen anything like this as we have witnessed over the past 1 or 2 weeks regarding U.S.-Russia relations?
I have never seen anything quite like this. When President Reagan came to Washington in 1981, he wanted to change U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union to make it tougher. But his work, his ideas were supported by a fairly large number of people in the U.S. Congress and a number of think tanks and experts. President Trump's views seem to come without that kind of intellectual support, if you will, and certainly in the Congress, really no prominent member of the Senate or the House of Representatives has defended the policy that President Trump seems to have toward Russia.
But Mr. Courtney, you know, many believe that Mr. Trump, the president now, is really an outlier. And also, he is just going to take a very different approach than his predecessors in terms of inspirations and in terms of possible policies, at least in the executive branch. So maybe some say he's going to shake the game and change the overall rules of the game, probably better for the United States. Mr. Courtney, your judgment here.
The United States has prospered since World War II, especially because of the development of liberal international rules, a rules-based international system. President Trump has called into question some of those. For example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been a major improvement in the rules-based trading and investment structure in the Asia-Pacific region. So it's not clear that shaking things up actually will be to America's advantage.
All right. Well, what about you, Mr. Golstein? What do you think? Mr. Trump likely to make a difference for better or for worse U.S.-Russia?
Well, one thing is clear that he is trying to change things. And what is fascinating is that I don't think he's, for time being, he's not that radical. But what is different from the past is this radical, I would say, hysteria of both chattering classes and the politicians, which try to do their best to attack him. So, but now we have, you know, these people who just go out of control to criticize Trump before he even try to say or do anything. So I think he is a realist. He sees that things change, that, you know, it's, it's the fault of others who don't see that, but so, not his fault.
Mr. Golstein, are you suggesting that the United States, at least Mr. Trump, is trying to play the Russia card toward China? Is that what you're saying?
He's, you know, I think, what I'm saying is that he is a realist. He understands that the policy as it used to be is not particularly productive. If you will look at American record in Middle East, in many other places, in Ukraine, it produces, you know, a lot of counter effects. You know, people are not happy. There is, you know, flood of refugees. There is destruction.
Okay.
So he clearly wants to change things. He sees that, you know, the country is not going in the right direction. Of course, we are not sure that he knows the right direction. That's a different story.
Okay.
So he sees that, you know, we are not doing particularly well.
But what about the other issues? I mean, Mr. Courtney, Mr. Golstein seemed to talk about several things. For example, about the Syrian crisis. Is there a better opportunity to cooperate with Russia if relationships are getting better? And also, what about the relationship with Iran? Can the United States now are doing a different approach when it comes to relations with Iran? Obviously, Russia and Iran have very different levels of relationship, as we all know. And also in the other areas of the Middle East and other parts of the world. Do you think that can be the approach? Will the Washington apparatus agree with that?
These issues are quite different. So let's take Syria and Iran. With regard to Syria, former Secretary of State Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov negotiated several ceasefires. But in the end, the Russians always supported Assad, who opposed the ceasefires, and the Russian forces joined Assad's forces in, for example, attacking civilian targets in eastern Aleppo. As a result of that, Washington will be very wary, cautious about cooperating with Russia in Syria, because Russian forces behave in a way that is, let's say, less careful with regard to civilian populations than U.S. forces. With regard to Iran, the Trump administration is strongly critical of Iran, and as you know, is imposing some new measures after a recent ballistic missile test by Iran. So on this issue, Russia and the U.S. are more opposed. So these situations are a little bit different in those two, and that will be true also in other parts of the Middle East. For example, in Afghanistan, Russia has traditionally supported U.S. and NATO involvement in Afghanistan because Russia is concerned about the threat from the Taliban. So there may be potential for cooperation in that area.
All right, interesting point over there, Mr. Golstein. To me, what Mr. Courtney is suggesting is on many issues, there is impossible opportunity for the two to work together because of ideological and long-held perspective issues, at least, to say the least. But on some of the others, the soil can be moved a bit. Do you think Moscow will have the political capacity to work on these possibilities, whether suggested by Mr. Courtney or by other American officials and advisors? What does it take politically for Russia to do that?
I think it will be very easy as far as Russia is concerned. Russia has always expressed its willingness to work and resolve many issues, and resolve them diplomatically, including the issues of Ukraine and many other subjects. What we're dealing with is this Washington consensus, which your guest expressed, is that Russia is inherently an enemy, or the consensus which this anchor O'Reilly expressed, that somehow Russia is an inherently evil country and we cannot deal with it. And this is absolutely a ridiculous concept, which, if you look at sort of Russian literature, there is a great novel by Dostoevsky called Possessed, where he expressed his dismay at one of the possessed who says that I do not believe in God, but I believe in my nation.
All right.
And that's what sort of all this hysterics express, that this is American believe in their exceptionality, and this is a demonic concept, which is, extreme nationalism, which is not based on anything. We try to do in America separate religion from the state, and this is a religious concept that we're an exceptional nation and we're better than anyone, and we don't want to work with anyone. And I think, once Americans get off their high horse and are willing to work with other countries, then things can move ahead.
Okay.
That's the position which this is the position of the rest of the world.
Okay, interesting. You use a phrase so-called "get off from the high horse." Interesting analogy, Mr. Courtney. My final point for you on this part, which is President Donald Trump the right person and the right approach for quote-unquote the United States get off from the high horse as being articulated by Mr. Golstein?
Well, President Trump could well evolve in how he deals with Russia. You'll recall that President Reagan came into office very critical of the Soviet Union, but ended up negotiating important arms control agreements once Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party and started to liberalize the system. President Reagan, at first, has been very favorable toward President Putin of Russia and Russia in general, but we've seen recently that the Trump administration has said that the sanctions on Russia because of its annexation of Crimea should remain. The Trump administration has been less categorical about sanctions regarding Russia's war in eastern Ukraine. So there's some concern there that perhaps President Trump might lift those sanctions even if Russia does not pull its troops and the Russian-funded, Russian-backed rebels out of eastern Ukraine.
Certainly, the mixed messages coming from the Trump administration is another fascinating point about this bilateral relations. When talking about U.S.-Russia relations, President Trump's reservations about NATO also could be an issue that crop up. While he signs praises about President Putin, he also sings a different tune towards European military allies. Before we go to the discussion, take a look at this.
We strongly support NATO. We only ask that all of the NATO members make their full and proper financial contributions to the NATO alliance, which many of them have not been doing.
That remark was made on Monday before U.S. troops. Friendly words reassuring the traditional U.S. ally, although his biggest criticism remains.
And if it breaks up NATO, it breaks up NATO.
Just months ago, Mr. Trump reiterated his reservations about NATO, fueling suspicions that he was ready to side with Moscow over allies in Europe. But the president's changing tone may help smooth over concerns.
I had previously said that NATO was obsolete because it failed to deal adequately with terrorism. Since my comments, they have changed their policy and now have a new division focused on terror threats. Very good. Very, very good. I also believe that we could find common ground with Russia in the fight against ISIS.
On Sunday, Mr. Trump agreed to meet NATO leaders in Europe in May. Will the U.S. manage to get along with both Russia and NATO under Mr. Trump, thanks to the common fight against terrorism?
Well, that is, of course, a big question. Go to you, Mr. Golstein. About NATO, Russia's relation with NATO not necessarily good at all, to say the least. So now some changes and some ruptures, it seems, between the United States and some of NATO members. What do you think might give a chance to Russia, to Moscow?
Yeah, should be a reappraisal of relationship between Russia and NATO, and I think President Trump is correct to call for it. I don't know whether he will follow on this call. His policy seems to be rather kind of erratic. But what we should be aware, when Russia agreed, Soviet Union agreed sort of to to move away from Warsaw Bloc,
right.
There was an agreement between President Gorbachev and the American counterpart is this NATO wouldn't expand. What we see that NATO expands further and further into closer to Russia, taking more and more countries. So we understand Russian concern.
Okay.
And President Trump understands that NATO is also became, instead of defensive bloc, became rather kind of offensive and threatening bloc. So he wants to revisit this issue.
Okay.
Whether he'll succeed or not, I don't know. But if
All
you
right.
allow to give me this little analogy with...
Mr. Courtney, I have to let you in at this point because we're really are running out of time for this discussion. Another share of your opinion.
Your quotes that you showed aptly show that President Trump's views have evolved. He is now strongly supporting NATO. He does want other NATO members to increase their defense spending to the 2% of GDP level that NATO has agreed. I think going forward, President Trump is going to find NATO is particularly important, both in holding together our allies for common challenges such as Afghanistan, if you will, but also dealing with the increased Russian threat in Western Russia, which has caused concern with the Baltics and Central and East European countries, in addition to the war that Russia is waging in eastern Ukraine.